Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on AI for All, where we'll be focusing specifically on how we can consider how we reduce bias in automation. My name is Amrita Devaya, and I'm the Deputy Director for Civil Service Communications and Cabinet Office Internal Communication and Engagement, and it's my pleasure to be here today. I'm going to say a little bit about the session so that you can whet your appetite, and then I'm going to introduce our panel. So, as AI develops, there are huge opportunities for us to automate our public service delivery and create better, more effective and less bureaucratic systems and services. But with that comes growing concerns from the public and also within the organisations that we work for, that the use of algorithms can perpetuate and exacerbate existing inequality, disparities and societal biases. So in this session, we are joined by our expert panel, and we are going to look at how government can ensure the safe development of AI and how to make sure that its use in our government services and beyond reduces and doesn't exacerbate some of these inequalities that we already see. So I'm joined by Mark Durkee, who's the Head of Data and Technology in the Responsible Tech Adoption Unit at the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. By Ed Towers, who is Head of Advanced Analytics and Data Science at the Financial Conduct Authority, and Dr. Moira Nicholson, who is the Lead Behavioural Scientist at the Cabinet Office. There is going to be an open Q&A, so I will start by asking our panel a couple of questions, but please do think about the questions that you might want to ask, and I'll be coming to you shortly. So, starting with you, Mark, can you please describe some of the safeguards that you and your team are putting in place to ensure safe development and use of AI, in particular to reduce these societal inequalities?
Yes, very happy to do that. I think first of all, it's probably worth just a moment's reflection on what we actually mean by bias and by fairness in AI, because it's a topic which I think we all sort of intuitively have a thought of what we think it means. Actually, when you talk to lots of people about this, you realise people have quite different ideas often about what they care about, what matters. And that's right, actually. What we mean by fair, what we mean by unbiased, what we mean by ethical, actually are really, really context dependent. I think there are not a kind of hard set of rules you can apply in every circumstance, a set of statistical measurements you can take to say that something's fair. You need to think about kind of the way it works in context. And for me, there's obviously plenty of examples where risks of bias are real, things can go wrong. I think, unfortunately, I missed the sessions first thing this morning, but I think a couple of them have already come up in previous sessions today. Obviously, if we don't think this stuff through, there are risks that things go wrong for citizens. I think we also need to remember, though, there are risks of us being too worried about this. If we are paralysed by fear that things might be biased, and we all lose out on some of the benefits you were talking about at the start, and we can't do the transformation we need to do. And actually, importantly, citizens lose the benefits from better use of data, better use of AI within our public services. So we need to worry about it, but not worry about it so much that we actually don't achieve benefits for anybody. What does worry about it mean in practice? Part of it, I think, is a pure question about bias. So we have, legally in the public sector, we have the public sector equality duty, and that says we should all be taking active steps to promote equality, to think about discrimination, to avoid it. I think there's a really interesting legal case specific to AI, South Wales Police and their facial recognition technology. They were found to have breached the PSED, not because they used facial recognition that was biased, no one ever thought about that. They were found to breach the PSED because they didn't check. There's a really active duty on all of us at the public sector just to think about the models we're using, to think about the AI we're using, and I think look statistically for bias, work out how it will affect different groups, how that works in your context. But I think that's not enough. And one of the things we do at the RTA is try to help organisations think a little bit systematically through a slightly broader set of ethical issues. So I think there are plenty of examples of AI models that are unbiased but are still grossly unfair. Personal opinion, I think A-level results, GCSE results saga a couple of years ago was perhaps a good example of that. In my opinion, Ofqual didn't actually do a bad job thinking about bias. They did lots of stats. They thought really, really hard about lots of the issues. There might have been some corners here or there where it wasn't perfect. but the outcome was pretty unfair. I think most of us would say that was not a fair set of outcomes. I think perhaps what they failed to do, and I think they would reflect in hindsight, and it wasn't just Ofqual, I should say, it was other regulators in other UK nations as well, was really think through the kind of fair process, did they have enough data to actually meaningfully estimate exam results? It wasn't that it was more or less fair to a particular group, it was just pretty unfair to everybody. And that was perhaps a failure to think broadly enough. We have a tool in the RTA called the Model for Responsible Innovation that we work with a number of organisations on, which helps people to think through in a kind of semi-structured way, what are all the issues you think about? So fairness issues, privacy issues, safety issues, broader societal impacts. Often we do that more as a conversation. It's not a kind of structured compliance set of things. It's a conversation of members of the team, people in the organisation with a view on the particular use case to work through what could go right, what could go wrong, what are the places we should be doing detailed work, detailed controls if we're to take forward a use case like this. And we find it's a really helpful way of exploring both bias but also some of the broader ethical issues around that.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Ed, anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually very helpful what Mark said as a way of intro, because I think there is one of those points being like people actually conflate a lot of these issues, right, of bias and fairness and, you know, all sorts of privacy and all sorts of things and kind of sum it up. But if we think about bias specifically, really we're kind of talking about does a group such as one of those groups of protected characteristics get a kind of unfair outcome from something essentially. And from a regulatory perspective, I guess we think about this in two ways. Like one, what we're doing ourselves, but also how financial services firms, are considering and ensuring like fair outcomes for consumers. I think, and our regulatory standpoint on this is that we really focus on the outcome, not prescribing exact methodology, but I think there are some kind of interesting points around it. I mean, I think one of the things is, in order to kind of mitigate bias, you also have to measure and record the characteristics, right? So if I want to know that the outcome of my algorithm is not giving an unfair outcome for women or ethnic minority groups, I actually need to have that data in some way, and so that I can assess it. And so I think there's an interesting conversation around, you know, actually mitigating bias sometimes has a bit of a trade-off for privacy, right? Because you need to have the data, not to use it in the model, but to actually test how effective your model is and whether there's any bias creeping in. So first you need to collect that data either directly or through kind of third parties where you can match the data, or through some kind of inference of the characteristics. But these things are not perfect. The easiest is obviously to collect the data. Then you need to kind of be measuring for it, and then you need to consider where bias is creeping in all stages of the process, right? So you can easily have, bias in the original data, right? So is your data set representative enough? So there's lots of examples like where facial recognition algorithms are not as good because they were trained on a data set which had more pale men in it than darker skinned women, for example, right? So you have to make sure there's a representative data set. You then need to, and actually it becomes quite, there are ways in which you can, if you take a skewed data set, start to think about, well, I need to weight that data, I need to make it more equitable. Then you need to think about the kind of modeling piece, and then you also need to think about how the algorithm gets used in the end. There's some kind of interesting stuff which maybe is also partly related to the behavioral side of these things, but there was a study in the US, I think, where judges were given an algorithm that was giving them a recommendation on bail, and they were given the opportunity to overwrite that algorithm where they thought it wasn't making the right decision. But in, I think, 90% of cases, the judge performed worse than the algorithm, and actually the outcomes massively increased the disparity between white and black individuals in that case. So I think there's also this really interesting aspect of how humans interact with the algorithm and how humans can reintroduce bias into an algorithmic decision-making process. And I think these are the same, whether you're talking about traditional machine learning AI or large language models, it's the same kind of issues, right? So with large language models, you're also thinking about trained on a massive set of data. Again, like that data has bias already within it, right? So it might, the word embeddings that are the foundation of those models might be biased because, it's more likely to say woman plus medical equals nurse than woman plus medical equals doctor, for example, because that's what's in the training data. So it's the same kind of challenges we have with those approaches and the same kind of things we need to think about when we look at the data it's being used on, how the algorithm is working, the weighting of that, and then how the end human in the loop is interacting with it.
Fantastic. And then I guess neatly leading on from that, from the behavioural point of view, Moira, do you want to add?
Yes, so I think I'll start with two things. First of all, I'll talk a bit about in general how you can, or the approaches that have been taken to mitigate the risks or the risk of harm arising from algorithm bias. And then I'll talk a bit about how we're doing it in the Government Communications Service in the Cabinet Office. So I think in general, there's two ways that we've seen this being managed. The first way is to improve the system itself, AI system itself. So that might be by improving the algorithm, trying to debias the algorithm. I won't talk in detail about that. I'm not an expert on that. The other way is to improve the quality of the underlying training data. And for instance, there are organizations like Value AI who are trying to provide better quality data that organizations can use to train their large language models. And that where you can actually credit the data generators with that content too, which is also another ethical component. So that's one way you can do it, and obviously there'll be kind of strengths and limitations of that approach. The other way that has obviously been discussed a lot is this idea of human in the loop. So you probably have heard of that, which is just the idea that you always maintain a human oversight where there's a decision being made by an algorithm, right? So you could kind of, the idea being that if the human looks at it and thinks, oh, this doesn't look right, they can override it, or where they think that this does look right, they go with it. And as already been referred to, the problem with this approach, or rather, it's not a panacea. I think that's the point. It's not. There's some trouble with it, which is that there's loads and loads of evidence over many years to suggest that actually human beings are not particularly good at judging the quality of algorithmic decisions and outputs. For a start, they will sometimes override good decisions, and other times they will go with bad decisions. So criminal justice system's a really good example. So there's a case in London police who, for instance, put too much stock in the models used to kind of do facial recognition, visual facial recognition, live visual facial recognition, and as a result, decisions like that have led to, I think, one of the first cases of an erroneous arrest in the US. And second of all, judges in the US where they have actually overruled algorithmic decisions that would have been correct. And in one case, it led to kind of racial disparities, but in another case, it just led to too many people being detained. So one of the things that algorithms have been used for in the criminal justice system is essentially to predict reoffending rates, and therefore to make decisions, and basically to allocate a risk score of reoffence, and then to decide whether they will essentially let that person out or let them out early. And what you find is that in the US, studies show that judges have overruled that and then have tended to essentially keep people in for longer than the algorithm would suggest is necessary. So that's, obviously not ideal. And the other thing is that, of course, it actually requires a lot of the people monitoring these algorithms, and they may not always have the power to overrule if they think it should be. So in other words, they don't always get it right. And even if they did get it right, do they have the power in the organisation to then say this isn't the decision that we ought to be making? So I'm not saying this isn't therefore to suggest that that's a death knell to the idea of human in the loop, but just to say that you can't just say that because we've got somebody overseeing this decision, it's therefore fine. That is not your get out of jail free card. You have to make sure, first of all, that the individuals have the relevant expertise, that they really understand the algorithms, that they understand the data. That's actually quite technical expert knowledge that you're acquiring of people. I mean, obviously lots of people are saying that as we embed more AI into workplaces and in decision making, we're going to need to have a new set of skills. So that's fine, but it's just to say that's another reason we need that. And the other thing is you've got to make sure that the individuals who are making those decisions or have the power, there's sufficient seniority behind overruling or indeed going with algorithmic decisions. So that's the sort of general overview of the challenges of human in the loop. The other thing I'll just briefly say is the approach that we're taking in the government communication service. So we're rolling out a conversational, like a sort of an in-house chat GPT to government communications professionals. And the approach that we've taken is really to be really evidence-based. We think a lot of the discussion around AI safety and algorithm bias is not very evidence-based. It's quite polarized. So we're taking the approach of measuring it. So for instance, when people are onboarded onto our tool, they all complete an onboarding survey. As part of that survey, we measure adoption amongst different characteristics, because another way in which inequality can arise is if some groups are less likely to adopt AI and therefore less likely to benefit from it. So that's one thing we're doing. And the other thing is we're actually anticipating the possible risks that could arise far beyond just algorithm bias. There are also other risks that might actually be harder to spot. The good thing about algorithm bias is that we know it's possible because we can see it when we generate images and they're sort of like racially profiled. But there are other risks that could arise that we actually can't predict so easily. So we're taking an approach where we've basically gone through all of the prompts anonymously, of course, looked at how people are using them, categorized all of those use cases, and then thought, for each use case, what could go wrong here? And then how can we actually make that go right? And how can we intervene to actually make sure not just that we don't get the risks, but actually that we really get the benefits? Because obviously another risk is that we don't benefit from the advantages.
No, fantastic. Thank you. Really interesting points there. And I think ones that many of us can relate to, particularly, I think, well, both you and Ed spoke about the cases in the public domain where AI has created situations which people will feel are deeply unfair. So I guess next question is very much around that public trust and how do we build public trust in these technological advances and in the way that we use them in our public services as well. So, you know, Mark, I'll come to you with the first with the question again. Come back, but you know, how can we go about building that trust both publicly and also with our colleagues who might not be quite as tech savvy, who, when you hear the words AI, balk at it, like what could we be doing to make sure that we create that sort of space where people feel comfortable with using AI in their day-to-day?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think often it's quite useful to be a little bit semantic for a moment, to think about the difference between something being trustworthy and it being trusted. I think you can probably think of examples of things that are one or the other, but not both, in both directions. So things that are actually quite well built, quite well designed, but someone gets scared, it blows up into a big media story or a big internal concern, and then the benefits never end up happening. And vice versa, things that probably shouldn't really be trusted, but actually people do trust and do use loads. Maybe Facebook's an example. I don't know to pick up one individual thing, but social media broadly, certainly. Like, I think many of us, if we think through social media, think there's a few things here that should worry us a lot. The reality is, most of us use it all the time in our daily lives, and for some measure of trust, we trust it because we use it, right? And we might, if we're honest, step back and go, we probably shouldn't trust this, but I think our behaviour suggests we are trusting it, we are using it. I think as government, we'd like to do better than that. We'd like to achieve both of these things. We'd like the things we do to be both trustworthy, all the stuff we just talked about around fairness, bias, and other issues, but also we need the public to trust them, otherwise they won't succeed. Lots of examples of government data programs that didn't really go anywhere because we couldn't build the trust in the public that we needed to get them to go somewhere. I think aside from the making it trustworthy, but I think the other bit around trust is probably understanding what drives citizen trust in these things. So we as RTO do quite a lot of public attitude research, both generally looking at attitudes to data and AI use kind of in the round in the economy, but also specifically looking at kind of individual use cases, individual projects that public sector bodies are doing, and what would it mean for those to be more trustworthy? What choices can we make in our design, in our implementation of them that will increase trust? A lot of it, we find, it's fair to say, and then the general tracking is less about trust in data and AI and much more about trust in government and institutions. And we find there's a pretty close correlation between people's opinion on how much they trust government or particular bits of government with their data, with how much they trust those things otherwise. I think that's sort of not helpful as data professionals because we need to just fix the organisations. But I think it is also quite helpful in understanding that citizens don't particularly see data and AI as a driver of trust. What they see is public services and government, and do these things work for them? Are they useful? Do they feel that their views are being heard, that they have a right to challenge things that may have been done that don't quite work for them? Those things are common to data-driven approaches and human-driven approaches. But actually, that gives us quite a good hint about some of the things that we can do to improve. And I think building like more trustworthy institutions as a whole actually therefore becomes a big part of it. And I'm going to give a very specific example there, I suppose. If we ask people, do you trust the NHS with your data and do you trust government with their data? A lot more people say yes about the NHS than government. And I don't think that's particularly an informed view that the NHS are better at handling data than government is. It's much more of a kind of gut reaction to the institutions and people's feelings about them.
It's a really interesting point, and one that I know that in Government Communication Service we focus a lot of our attention on, and particularly that link between, and interesting link between people's trust in government and also satisfaction in government and public services. Yeah, and I mean, when you were talking about social media, that was first thing in my mind. People give so much of their personal data to these social media platforms, and yet there is this real reticence with sharing with government, and a really interesting point on trust. Ed, handing over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything that Mark said, and I think personally, I think it's really important that we kind of lean into A, the actual debate around this, and B, the issue around kind of transparency. So I think one of the fundamental bits is people are not that kind of aware of how their data is used or how that decision is being made. And that's not just a public sector thing. I think it would be the same in financial services, right? And in other areas, you know, where you're kind of like, well, you know, if I'm giving you my data, like, do I really meaningfully understand how you're using that? If you're making a decision using my data, do I really meaningfully understand how that decision is being arrived at? And I think we've got a problem with that at the moment before we add on, you know, AI. Like, in the, you know, another example, more data than AI, but in the UK, obviously, open banking, for example, massive potential to benefit people and provide them with better services. I think we're now at about 9 million users, but lots of people still feel a bit uncomfortable about that. Like, well, where is my data going? How's it going to be used? Who can access it, right? And I think the potential is that AI just makes that sort of like slightly unpinned down kind of ick factor worse, because people are like, well, isn't AI even more black boxy and isn't it going to do more? So I think, you know, for the benefit of the public sector and for the UK economy as a whole, I think we need to address some of these issues, and we need to start thinking about actually how in these decision-making processes we can give people more transparency, and doing some of the research with end users and consumers around, like, well, how do I meaningfully explain your use of data and the decision-making process for you? Because if we can do that, then it accelerates the use of data, and it really will also drive our kind of economy. And I think we do need to be particularly worried about this in the UK, because I think historically we have more concern about this kind of stuff than other countries, right? If you look at some of the kind of ratings, like the UK is relatively high on concern of those versus other countries, obviously particularly versus China, etc. And I do think it will hold actually some of the potential benefit for wider society back if we don't have this conversation, and sort of people have, like, we've kind of steered away from it since the debacle around the physical ID cards, right? And it resurfaces around digital ID and around AI. And I think unless we actually, you know, lean into that and have a proper debate, we won't be able to move these things properly forward.
Yeah, and I think it is that understanding of what AI sounds to lots of people like iRobot, kind of, you know, taking over the world, when actually AI is part of our daily lives in a number of ways, and we don't realise it. And I wonder whether, you know, I'm sure there are questions in the audience as well, but I wonder whether there's something around how we design these programmes of work and products with humans at the centre, and start to sort of debunk some of the ideas that people have. Moira?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll talk about this from the perspective of building trust amongst public servants to use AI tools, because I think that's really, really important if we're going to get the benefits of, you know, driving productivity and efficiencies and impacting government. So I tend to think about this from the pillars of trust. So there's three, you know, key pillars of trust. So You've got competence that we use the tools for the right purposes and well, that we don't make mistakes that then kind of undermine trust. That we demonstrate that our goal with using AI is to improve people's working lives and also the service that we're providing. So that's that sort of benevolence component. And then finally, obviously, transparency. But obviously, transparency isn't enough on its own if you're not also showing that it's going to be used for something good. So, for instance, it'd be very easy to clearly explain to the parents of the children who were given lower exam scores why. I doubt that would have made people feel any better about it, right? So the first thing when it comes to sort of demonstrating the sort of this is for the good of government and people, is I think we know that roughly speaking, and this is there's still data being collected on this, that there's about a third of people who in government are quite keen to use AI tools, like early adopters, really want to sign up. And we've seen this definitely in the government communication service. We don't have any problem getting people signing up. Like, people really want to. We've got people, trying to get on when we're rolling out in stages. So that's no problem for a certain early group of adopters. You will get a third of people who are kind of like, a bit, they don't really care either way. And then a third, and this will vary from department to department, who might be actually like, I actually don't think I want to use this because I don't know what this is going to mean for my job or for my organisation. So I think one of the really key things, and I think it's already been mentioned, is that we have to make sure that when we're designing the tools, that we're showing people how it's going to make their job better and not more boring, because nobody wants to become a proofreader for AI, right? That's not an exciting prospect for people. People want exciting, interesting, meaningful work. So we also have to make sure that we can find out from people, and this is one thing that we do a lot of, is user research, to find what is it you actually want to use this for? What tasks do you actually find boring that you would like this to be doing? And I think that's another really important way of getting buy-in. Because we don't want to replace tasks that people want to do. So that's one component of it. And then when it comes to things like transparency, I think something that's really, really important is that we have to be really clear with people about what we want to use AI for within government. So within different departments, what are our plans for it? And also, if there are roles that we might think, actually, in 10 years' time might not be a core component of what government does in the way that it was in the past, we need to communicate that to people and then say what the plan is for moving those people into different types of roles. There's no problem with that. And actually, being open about that is going to be much, much better than keeping quiet. And then people then think, actually, what is going to happen to my job? Was in actual fact, what we actually want is for people to upskill, right? Get better, like thinking about that human in the loop point, get better at being able to work with AI to do their job. So I think that's really important. And of course, obviously, using AI and showing that you're doing it well and being able to show case studies of success, I think will be really important for civil servants in seeing it being used well, because it is just one of those things that often it's the things where, the stories where it didn't work so well are the ones that get the most press.
No, absolutely. And it's that becomes a negative bias in itself. No, really, really, really pertinent points. We talk about change a lot across the civil service, and obviously this is, and we talk about AI, we don't necessarily always talk about them together. And when we talk about change communications, we're really, really clear that we are honest and we are transparent and we share information as soon as we have it, whether we know something or we don't, and we put people at the heart of what we're doing. And yet actually sometimes maybe we haven't closed the loop on that as well. I'm going to open this up to audience Q&A. So does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask our panel? Yes, there's a microphone coming to you.
So I'm Taylor HMRC. There's a system archetype that's often used when you have something where, like, an augmenter to a system might be a contractor, it might be external, it might be somebody who's helping with something, where your sort of underlying skills sort of gradually deteriorate over time. You don't need to use your own skills anymore. You can just got your assistant do it for you. And I think in the AI context, there may be concern that as over time, our ability to check the AI might kind of erode, because we just press OK, you don't need to check that anymore. So how can we ensure that if we got like those ethical frameworks in place, that we actually maintain them over time and don't just sort of get a bit lazy?
Yeah, Mark, you look like you've got an answer.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's perhaps less about maintaining the ethical frameworks and more just about maintaining the skilled people doing the operational jobs. And I think in lots of contexts, maybe HMRC, I'm not sure if HMRC is a good example here or not, but certainly, job centres, probation, those kind of frontline operational bits of government. It feels like the thing we're really struggling for at the moment is enough human contact hours. Those frontline people really struggle to have enough time to talk to people, to properly understand people with difficult and unusual circumstances. That's the problem we've already got. And actually, if we can free up their time from the routine stuff, I think in some ways it should make them more skilled, and it should make them spending more time on the high-skill human things that they want to be doing and only they can be doing. I think the thing that is a genuine risk, though, and I don't really know how to solve it, is what happens when the machine breaks or goes wrong for a category of things, and you've no longer got a team there to deal with them at scale, and you've kind of forgotten how you used to organise yourself. I'm right. I used to have a next door neighbour who was a merchant navy captain who used to grumble occasionally that people, today's captains couldn't really navigate with the sextants anymore, and what would they do before the GPS went wrong? And it's kind of similar to that. In principle, you learn it. When you become qualified as a captain, I believe. I'm not a naval captain, but in reality, if you're not doing it day to day and you're not in the habit of kind of organising yourself around doing it, I think it is really hard. But I think that applies to lots of tech.
I mean, I think to add to it, that problem almost inevitably will happen unless you, maybe only in a minority of cases, but unless you build the safeguards in. It's like the GPS example where people drive off the cliff because they're just following the GPS, right? Or those people who were a few years ago just leaving their Teslas on autopilot and having car crashes because they weren't actually paying attention. I think you need your sort of equivalent of the dead man switch or the kind of review processes that make sure that people are still kind of consciously paying attention. I think you can build that in around a process, right, of whether it's QA, review, some kind of things. But I think you have to, because otherwise we probably will become too reliant on it. And if the technology isn't, it's the kind of human in the loop thing, if you think that the human does need to be in the loop, then you need to make sure there is a process that builds it in. If you're completely happy the technology is reliable, then you leave it to do it. But otherwise, you need the mechanism to make sure people are still paying attention.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think fundamentally you just make sure that for those core skills, if there was a failure, that you've trained people in them. I mean, it's a bit like how kids at school are still taught to do long division and learn the times tables, even though, most of us use calculators. So I think it would just be about identifying what those skills are and making sure that we continue to train people in them so that they're available when we need them.
Yeah, there's also, I think there's an interesting piece around organisational culture as well, and building that into the culture of your organisation. Yes, we've got another question over here. Sorry.
Hi, Emily Barrington, the Office for Stats Week. I know really you can't really see me, so I'm standing here. I was just going to ask about the comparison between, obviously, humans make biased decision-making as well, and there's a whole kind of bias of our human decision-making and whether we should be holding automated decision-making processes higher than ourselves. I'd possibly argue yes, but I'm just interested in thoughts from the panel on that. Thanks.
Go on.
Yeah, I have one particular perspective on this, because I've heard that point a lot. Bias from a human or from an AI, it doesn't really matter, it's bad. But what I would say is that, AI can probably make a lot more biased decisions than one human. So I think that's one thing to point out. In other words, if there's a bias in a system, right, it can make more biased decisions simply because it is automated, right? Obviously, it's limited by the computing power, but that's one thing I'd point out. But yeah, I don't think that it doesn't really matter from a logical perspective whether it comes from a human or an AI. However, from the public perception is that they would be more, I think, outraged by a unfair outcome due to AI than an unfair outcome due to human beings. And you can see that right in the discussions around it. So that would be my perspective on that. But all of the methods that we need to use to eliminate human bias in decision making, of which there is a lot around that, also different methods need to be applied to AI. So in other words, it's just I would say, the same problem caused by a different thing, but I think there is a risk that maybe AI can exacerbate it because it can make potentially many, many more decisions. But that's my perspective.
2 points on it, which is I agree with what you say. Like, I think what's interesting is obviously one of the main causes of bias and problems in algorithms is historical data, which was human-based decision making, right? So that's one of the main reasons why you end up with the bias, is because the humans have been making decisions for years in a very biased way, and then you've just turned it into an algo, which I think is also interesting because it actually highlights some of the benefits around this, which is ultimately humans are very much a black box algorithm, even more so than a transformer model of AI, right? And so I think actually making decisions by algorithm, even where those are complex models where we don't quite fully understand, they're still slightly more transparent than a human decision-making process, right? And that's why, but I do agree with you that in theory it shouldn't matter at all, but I think from a public perception perspective it matters more if AI makes a more biased decision.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to violently agree. I think the scalability point that Moira made is incredibly important. Like I might go for a job interview and the interviewer might just not like the shape of my face and be a bit biased against me, and that's probably okay because I can go to a different job interview and get a different job interview and it's fine. If the same AI is assessing my CV for all the companies I apply for, that's a much bigger problem, and I think that sort of scalability issue does really, really matter and perhaps does drive a slightly higher standard. The other thing I'd say is I think, I'm not a lawyer, but I think this is quite interesting legally. We can often measure how an AI model behaves and we can measure bias in it in a way we actually can't measure bias in humans. Policing is a good example. So we can measure a facial recognition model in policing and say, how biased is it racially, and we can quantify that. I suspect we might often find that even the ones that have got a problem are better than humans that are also imperfect at facial recognition. I'm terrible at recognising faces, and probably, if we're all honest, we have some racial disparities in our ability to recognise faces. The racial groups that we see more often, we're much better at distinguishing between people in. You could quantify that if you measured it hard, but you can't quantify it for the real world workforce. You could find that you have a model which you know is better than humans, but you've proved that it's biased. And I think there's some interesting legal issues there where a public sector body finds themselves if they think they're making the world better than it is currently by introducing it, but they've proved it's not perfect. Therefore, how do they act? I'm not sure of the answer.
Really interesting. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Hello, my name is Thomas Christensen. I come from Denmark. I'll talk a little later about what we've done in Denmark, but one of the big discussions that I see in Denmark right now is on the ethical side. So I used to run a lot of different experiments, if you will, for government, even years back, where we could use data to even predict just looking at kids going to the school dentist. How many holes did they have? And we could kind of see they're going to get in trouble. The parents are not making sure they're brushing their teeth, and the projects were being shut down one after another because the politicians said this is not ethical that we are using this data, even though we knew we could get in with an early and save society a lot of money. So I think, bias, yes, but I think the ethical dimension is very, very important when we talk about these type of data sets that we're using.
Thank you. Any reflections on that and working in Denmark? And I understand that Denmark has just been announced as the most AI efficient nation in the world or something, or uses data best in the world. There we go. So lots of things to think about there. On the ethical side, Mark.
Yeah, I guess a number of directions to go for. I think it's a really interesting point. I think one of the things it highlights is that actually the measurement of what you mean by fair or biased in practice in a real use case is harder the more you think about it. Particularly where you're looking at things where there are genuine social differences between groups, there are genuine historical unfairnesses, historical biases, but also just sort of different social norms and changes. How you unpick that from bias you might be introducing by the way you're behaving versus things that were there before that you might want to correct a bit is really, really hard. And I'm not entirely sure there's a general answer to it, but I think being clear and transparent about what you're doing and why and how you're checking it is about the best you can do. The politics is probably a different thing and not easily solvable always.
And I very much agree with that. So it's obviously true, right, that the ethics is wider than bias, right? And that actually there's trade-offs between, as I said, between bias and privacy and accuracy of models, etc. I think that transparency is really important in this, because it's like the example you gave of, I'm not sure if we'd have explained to people how the exam results were being made, whether they'd have been happy about it. And as you say, they're not necessarily biased, right? But they're just but actually, those kind of discussions have to be had in society, right? In a sense, right? We need to decide, are we happy with that or not, right? And that's perfect. And I think ultimately it's perfectly legitimate if we decide we've weighed this up, we've kind of had an informed debate around it rather than just kind of gut reaction. We decide actually we don't want that. But unless you create the transparency around it, you can't test what we as a society decide is appropriate. And I think in the education example, it's like, well, if they had to explain how that model was working, what features it was using before they rolled it out, or they knew they had to do that, then probably never would have actually got that far, because they would have been like, oh, actually, when we say this, people are going to really hate that, so we can't possibly use it, right? So I think it's why everything does come back to a level of kind of, let's be clear around what data is being used and how it's being used and how decisions are being made, so that we can decide whether the trade-offs are appropriate. It's very complex, so I don't think you can kind of draw too many general rules.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say about this is, so when I think of ethics, I think of it, ethics is about what we think ought to happen. And there's two components to that, right? Is about how the decision is made, so sort of fairness in the procedures that you use to arrive at a decision, and then also fairness and outcome. And those two are slightly different things, right? So you could have a very fair process that leads to an outcome that people might say that's not right, we don't really want that, which might be the case, for example, with the education example. And I think one of the ways that you can address that is actually just by having that discussion about what are our ethical values, like what do we want to work towards. So we have our framework for ethical innovation that innovators can use in government to make decisions about, what essentially it sets out the ethical principles. And so we say, these are the principles, okay? And then in theory, that would apply to everybody, including politicians, and so, that's that. But then there's also, well, how do you get people to follow those ethical principles? So there's a huge literature on ethics in public service and how to sort of encourage ethical decision making. And of course, the civil service has the civil service values. But of course, there's also incentive structures that can sometimes make it difficult for people to align themselves with those values. So I think you made the point that, if, for instance, someone had been forced to explain the algorithm that reached the decision ahead of time before awarding the exam results, that would have been stopped. But not necessarily the case, right? It would also have to be that people would think, oh, this is an outcome we would want to avoid. And of course, you might take that for granted, okay? But I think the other thing that's really important, and it often comes up, and I think is the most obvious way to get better ethical decision making in government, by the way, I'm not suggesting there's not ethical decision making, to be clear, is to have a government that and the civil service that is more representative of the people and the interests of the people that we are serving. Because the other thing I would say is that it would have been patently obvious to somebody who'd looked at that decision-making process, particularly if they themselves had children going to these schools, it would have been obvious, I don't want this to happen to my children, right? And I think that would have been a much easier way to stop that from happening. Because, when you're personally affected by something, you take steps to stop it. And that's not suggesting anyone's callous because they aren't personally invested, but simply that our personal experiences and our life background does affect the decisions we make and our ethical perspective. So my view is that, and that is already, right, a big part of a government goal, right, is to improve the representativeness of the civil service. And I think the quicker we can do that, the much more likely that we are to have better outcomes from AI.
Can I just follow up quickly?
Yeah,
on that? I think the Ofqual example is fascinating for all sorts of reasons. I think one of the things I find interesting about it is I think they were actually really transparent. Like we do a load of work on transparency as RTA. We think it's incredibly important. Actually, Ofqual published all the fine details of what they were doing in advance. They did loads of teacher consultation, and no one said it was a bad idea. Like it's funny, and I think the bit that possibly is, like, obviously they were doing it at pace. The world was chaotic. We all we're all going through massive changes in our lives and probably not quite thinking straight, if we're totally honest, around that period. I think what's really interesting is that the constraint they were under was, I suppose, an inability to say no. They had to do something.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think it can be quite hard. The way we set projects up in government, the way we incentivise senior leaders in projects is to get on and deliver and achieve the outcome they're set up to deliver. And sometimes in this context, I think we are going to find things where the data-driven technology we've set out to invent or deliver doesn't actually work. And sometimes the answer may be to say, actually, you know what, we just can't do this. We need to do something different instead. And I think we're not always very good at finding the checkpoints. On the rare occasion we do just need to say, actually, no. Setting up our projects in the right way to make that possible.
I mean, a couple of really interesting points there, and probably an entirely different session that we could go on to. But really, really interesting, I think, around representation and then people feeling able to speak up. And Maura even mentioned that a couple of times. And actually, Mark, just then, it sort of, in my mind, made me think about the criticism that's been levelled at the civil service over the last few months in particular, but not just in that time. And actually, how are we, again, I keep coming back to culture, but how are we creating a culture where people feel able to speak up, whether you are the human in the loop or whether you are part of a programme of work that's going at pace, and still making sure that we are delivering outcomes that can be trusted and trustworthy, and in particular, how we ensure that our colleagues are on board with that and able to feel empowered to engage in that space, whether they are part of the programme design or whether they are part of the sort of the human face of government, as it were. We are down to our last 2 minutes. We've got one more question. Go on. Just here at the front. There's a microphone coming to you.
It seems quite complex to implement the sort of algorithmic transparency recording standard when you've got an AI system involved. And so I just wondered if anyone had actually done one of those or worked it through or thought it through, because you want the training data, and so that rules out most things.
That's one for me, I think. And I can see you actually from DCIT, so maybe we can have a separate conversation. We are thinking about this. By an AI system, I think you really mean a kind of large language model or a frontier AI system with large and complex data sets. We are thinking about it because we know it's not perfect for those situations. We are talking to people like Microsoft about it as well, about the best approach. So yeah, if you're looking at it, we're very happy to have a conversation.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm going to come back to the panel and ask them to wrap up with the one thing that they'd like you to take away from what has been, I'm sure you'll agree, a very fascinating discussion. I'm going to start from the other end. So, Moira, sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. So I think the first thing is that, don't just rely on human in the loop. Make sure that you've supported your humans to be really good AI users and really build their AI literacy. That would be a big, big thing that I would say. And that includes everybody working on it as well as leadership. And that might be a separate set of training, separate set of engagement. And we're doing this to help leaders make sure that, for instance, that the teams that you're even assembling to roll out AI are composed of interdisciplinary experts, not just, I just always think about the grand designs with Kevin MacLeod, who always says, you must have a project manager. You can't just have a project manager. You also need, user researchers. You also need social scientists. And where that isn't possible, we are actually working on developing a sort of best practice guide from what we've learned from rolling out our tool Assist that we can share across government. And also we're very interested to get feedback on it, so it can be a living document. But that's what I would leave you with.
Fantastic. Ed.
I think my point is very similar from a different angle. It's like there is no one solution to it, right? I think is the point, right? It can't be human in the loop. Can't be that you can remove bias from the original data set and that will solve everything. Like there might be some techniques that promise you can get rid of bias in LLMs through debiasing and so on. No one of these things is going to be the perfect solution, right? So you kind of have to throw the kitchen sink at it to a certain extent and take that multifaceted approach with lots of different angles in order to kind of mitigate it as much as possible.
Yeah, I was also going to say something incredibly similar, so I'll say something different instead. I think, just to end on an optimistic note maybe, I think lots of the evidence so far of where problems have been found is that a lot of these problems are fixable. And I think we should remember that we should be kind of approaching the problems not with it's all broken, but with how do we fix this problem, because we're going to need to use this technology. It's coming regardless of whether we like it or not. And the question is kind of how do we do it best rather than do we do it at all.
Fantastic. Thank you all very, very much, and thank you for your questions. We hope you found it useful, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.